Since ancient times, there have been three great changes in man's idea of himself. Three major blows dealt us in our vanity. Before Copernicus, we thought we were the center of the universe, and that all the heavenly bodies revolved around our Earth. But the great astronomer shattered that conceit, and we were forced to admit our planet is but one of many which swing around the sun. That there are other systems beyond our solar system, and myriad worlds. Before Charles Darwin, man believed he was a species unto himself, separate and apart from the animal kingdom. But the great biologist made us see that our physical organism is the product of a vast evolutionary process whose laws are no different for us than for any other form of animal life. Before Sigmund Freud, man believed that what he said and did were the products of his conscious will alone. But the great psychologist demonstrated the existence of another part of our mind, which functions in darkest secrecy and can even rule our lives. This is the story of Freud's descent into a region almost as black as hell itself, man's unconscious, and how he let in the light.
Sigmund Freud was inarguably one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. His pioneering of psychoanalysis would go on to influence many of the most important philosophers of the decades following, and would gradually seep its way into Western culture. Among those most influenced by Freud are the thinkers set on deconstructing the invisible underlying structures and driving forces of society. The Frankfurt School, for example, a group of academics critical of modern capitalism and Marxism alike, built the foundations of their critical theories on the insights of Marx and Freud, among others. Likewise, the philosophers of the postmodern tradition sought to take apart the meta-narratives of society, the underlying presuppositions, whether they be cultural, sociological, or even linguistic, the stories we tell ourselves or are told about the world we live in and how to think about it, the ideas and notions we take for granted. Both of these schools of thought would be major influences on the various counterculture movements that emerged in the 1960s, allowing for the empowerment of marginalized groups and ideologies by shifting the focus of public discourse over to the tools and methods of oppression that are inherent in our modern world. This desire to deconstruct follows naturally from Freud's lifelong interest in the underlying structures of the mind itself, these unseen narratives that drive our actions and beliefs. And although many of these thinkers were critical of some of the more dogmatic features of Freud's philosophy, there's no denying the fact that most of these schools of thought probably wouldn't have developed in the way they did without that original psychoanalytical seed planted by Freud at the turn of the century. However, somewhat antithetically to Freud's impact on the counterculture movements of the 60s, his ideas also influenced, and perhaps had an even greater impact on, an entirely separate side of American society. In the 2002 documentary series The Century of the Self, Adam Curtis sets out to track the influence of Freud's ideas on those who seek to control the, quote, dangerous crowd in an age of mass democracy.
This episode is about Freud's American nephew, Edward Bernays. Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and use them to manipulate the masses. He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. Out of this would come a new political idea of how to control the masses.
So, while Freud's ideas influenced the development of schools of thought that came into existence with the intent of criticizing the controlling forces of society, his ideas were also influencing the very people who made it their job to control the masses. Needless to say that Freud's theories have permeated society in many ways. Testament to this is the fact that everyone watching this video has heard of the subconscious, the concept of repressed memories and Freudian slips, and many have probably heard of the Oedipal complex, or the id and the ego. Point being that Freud is a way bigger part of our everyday lives than we might at first realize. It should come as no surprise then that Freud's influence also extended to the arts. Notably, early on, the Surrealists who emerged in the 1920s, and who found themselves delving deep into this new, unexplored territory that is the world of dreams and the unconscious, with a level of experimentation and abstraction which was heavily inspired by Freud's work on free association and dream analysis. André Breton, one of the leaders of the Surrealist movement, worked as a psychiatrist during the war and even used Freud's psychoanalytical methods on soldiers suffering from shell shock. And of course, over the years, Freud's ideas made their way to Hollywood as well. And the films I'm going to be talking about today come at a point in American history where these concepts and ideas are just starting to seep into popular culture. And I believe that these movies give us great insight into how the general public and artists alike were reacting to and coming to accept these ideas. This manifests itself in a kind of new genre of film that emerged in the mid-1940s, which used Freud's theory as a narrative device in a blend of melodrama and psychological thriller. Perhaps the best place to start is with Hitchcock's 1945 film Spellbound, which literally opens with an explanation of what psychoanalysis is. Following the British melodrama from the same year, The Seventh Veil, which tells the story of a suicidal mental patient who is urged by her doctor to remove the veils of her repressed memory in order to get to the bottom of her issues, Hitchcock's Spellbound is perhaps one of the first mainstream films to popularize the use of Freudian concepts and theories as narrative devices. Spellbound stars Ingmar Bergman as Constance Peterson, working in a mental hospital in Vermont, who finds herself falling in love with the newly arrived Dr. Edwards, played by Gregory Peck. Constance begins to notice a few peculiarities with Dr. Edwards, however, like how he seems to display a strange phobia of parallel lines. By comparing handwriting, she realizes this man is not the real Dr. Edwards, and he ends up confessing to Constance that he actually killed the doctor and took his place, but that he has amnesia and doesn't even remember who he really is. So Constance sets out to use her psychoanalytic training to overcome his amnesia and figure out what really happened. And it turns out that his name is actually John Ballantyne and was a patient of the real Dr. Edwards. The two of them went on a ski trip together where Ballantyne witnessed the doctor being murdered, and which, due to the incident's similarities to a traumatic event from Ballantyne's childhood, became a mental block in his mind that blacked out the event and erased his memory. The standout features of this film are the dream sequences designed by Salvador Dali. These scenes are pivotal to the story as they hold the key to unlocking Ballantyne's repressed memories. Freud's basic idea when it comes to dreams is that they are manifestations of unconscious desires, fears, and various impulses. Dreams are essentially wish fulfillment, a place where all of these unconscious drives express themselves, as our defense mechanisms and conscious suppressors are dormant. But according to Freud, in our dreams, our subconscious comes to us in disguise, and it's the analyst's job to piece together the hidden meanings of this unconscious puzzle.
The secrets of who you are and what has made you run away from yourself, all these secrets are buried in your brain. But you don't want to look at them. The human being very often doesn't want to know the truth about himself because he thinks it will make him sick. So he makes himself sicker, trying to forget. You follow this? Now, here's where dreams come in. They tell you what you are trying to hide, but they tell it to you all mixed up like pieces of a puzzle that don't fit. The problem of the analyst is to examine this puzzle and put the pieces together in the right place and find out what the devil you are trying to say to yourself.
Eventually, Constance and Dr. Brulov figure out what all of the subconscious fragments of John's dream represent. The gambling house represents Green Manors and its inmates, the bearded man is presumably the real Dr. Edwards, the blackjack game and the 7 of clubs represent the 21 club which Ballantyne and Edwards had once been to, the blank cards are a sign of Edwards' denial, the eyes on the curtain represent the guards of the asylum, and Ballantyne cutting them is an expression of his wish to escape, the man behind the mask is the proprietor trying to hide his identity, the wheel represents a revolver and the sloping roof is the slope at Angel Valley. The wings stand for his being chased by Constance, who he sees as an angel, but they also refer to Gabriel Valley, the ski resort where the murder took place, represented in the dream by the bottom of the hill. It's in this latent content that the real meaning of the dream is to be found. Even deeper in John Ballantyne's subconscious lies the explanation for why all these repressed memories and feelings have been blocked from his consciousness. When he was a boy, he accidentally killed his brother while sliding down a snowy slope. The repressed memory of this event is reawakened when he witnesses the murder on the slopes of the ski resort, thus triggering a transfer of guilt from the death of his brother to the death of the real Dr. Edwards.
Remember now, I killed my brother.
So here in this film, we already see some of the features of psychoanalysis that will remain prominent within this new Hollywood genre. The focus on concepts such as repressed memories and transferred guilt, the use of symbols that lend themselves well to a visual exploration of a character's psyche in this medium of film. But more important than any of those, in my opinion, is the very structure of the film itself. This is what we'll find repeated over and over throughout similar films of this period, as we can see in another Hitchcock film from 1964, Marnie, which is the last of what many consider to be Hitchcock's Freudian trilogy, also including his 1960 classic Psycho. What Marnie has in common with Spellbound is that base formula of a story built around a romantic relationship where one of the characters realizes the other person is suffering from some sort of deep-seated psychological trauma. We then go through the process of uncovering what's hidden deep within that character's psyche, and the story resolves itself when that trauma is resolved. But while Spellbound had a somewhat happy ending,
you will be tried as a sane murderer, convicted as a sane man, and killed in the electric chair for your crime. I'm going to telephone the police now, Dr. Murchison.
Marnie's conclusion is not so optimistic. Marnie is the story of the titular Marnie, played by Tippi Hedren, who goes around finding jobs in various different kinds of companies, stealing money from them, then changing her identity and getting a job somewhere else to do the same thing over and over again. This is until Mark Rutland, played by Sean Connery, catches onto her schemes and after tracking her down, blackmails her into marrying him so he won't tell the police. Yeah, so the most interesting thing about this film, other than all the Freudian stuff, is that Sean Connery's character is extremely problematic in pretty hilarious ways. The way they explain Mark's interest in Marnie is that he has this hobby, which is essentially that he's really into wild animals and zoology in general. So Marnie's character is framed as a wild animal that Mark needs to learn how to tame, in a sense.
I can't!
For God's sakes, Marnie.
If I can't stand it, I'll die. If you touch me again, I'll die.
I won't touch you. I promise I won't touch you. Just get out of that damn corner, please. Now, suppose you tell me what this is all about. Is it your own little way of saying you don't find me particularly attractive?
The only way you can help me is to leave me alone. Can't you understand? Isn't it plain enough? I cannot bear to be handled.
Well, have you always felt like this?
Always, yes.
Why, what happened to you?
Happened? Nothing. Nothing happened to me. I just never wanted anybody to touch me.
You ever tried to talk about it? To a doctor or somebody who could help you?
No, why should I? I didn't want to get married. It's degrading. It's animal. Anyway, I was doing all right the way I was.
I wouldn't say that, Marnie. If I hadn't caught you, you'd have gone on stealing.
No, I wouldn't.
Yes, you would. Again and again. Eventually, you would have got caught by somebody. See, you're such a tempting little thing. Some other sexual blackmailer would have got his hands on you. The chances of it being someone as permissive as me are pretty remote. But we're going to be on this damn boat for many days and nights. So let's just drop the whole thing for the present and try to get through this bloody honeymoon cruise with as much grace as possible. Let's try at least to be kind to each other.
Oh, kind.
All right, that's too much. I'll be kind to you, and you'll be polite to me.
You won't?
I won't. I give you my word.
If you don't mind, I'd like to go to bed. I've told you the light from the sitting room bothers me.
Well, we certainly can't have anything bothering you, can we?
If you don't want to go to bed, please get out.
But I do want to go to bed, Marnie. I very much want to go to bed.
No!
I'm sorry, Marnie.
But of course, Marnie's issues are all linked to a traumatic childhood event. The parallels between this film and Spellbound are fairly obvious. A dream to be interpreted, an emotional trigger, here the colour red, which plays a similar role to the parallel lines in Spellbound, and a neurotic character who is suspicious of psychoanalysis, yet comes to be cured after being forced to relive a past traumatic experience. Here, Marnie's trauma manifests itself in a combination of man-hatred and kleptomania. The latter is to be analysed in terms of an association she makes between the notion of earning and the painful incident she is trying to repress. She steals from men and sends the money back to her mother, whose past profession lies at the heart of her neurosis. Mark ends up taking Marnie to Baltimore where her mother lives in order to confront the repressed memory. Turns out her mother used to be a prostitute, and when she was a child, one of her mother's clients tried to molest Marnie, and she killed the man with a fireplace poker. But her mother took the blame to protect her. What I appreciate about the conclusion of this film is that the story doesn't end in perfect Hollywood fashion, with our female lead falling in love with Sean Connery and therefore resolving the issue of their problematic relationship just because he cured her. No, the closest thing we get to that happy ending is Marnie telling Mark that she'd rather stay with him than go to jail. Not exactly romantic.
Oh, Mark. I don't want to go to jail. I'd rather stay with you.
Had you, love?
this film portrays an interesting and fairly complex relationship between Marnie and her subconscious. Freud divides human consciousness into three separate entities: the ego, the superego, and the id. To simplify things for the sake of clarity, the ego is the conscious experiencer of things, your perceptions, your thoughts. Essentially, it's what you identify as when you say I. The superego is all the aspects of your psyche that seek to harness and police your ego. So these are things associated with social norms, various moral and cultural constraints, your conscience, basically. And the id is what lies entirely in the unconscious substrata. It's all those deep-seated fears, desires, memories, and drives. Basically all of the things that your superego is attempting to suppress. In Marnie, there's a lot of dark stuff to be repressed, so the ego does this by representing Marnie as a cold thief who will not let her feelings get in the way. Marnie's id is shaped by a traumatic experience, which can only be accessed through the methods of psychoanalysis. This trauma evokes a fear of sex and a violent disposition towards men. At the beginning of the film, Marnie is not conscious of any of these underlying drives or suppressing agents of her consciousness. She believes she is in control, but in reality, she's at the mercy of her subconscious. And as the story progresses, Mark manages to help her understand what lies underneath. Fritz Lang's Secret Beyond the Door, released 2 years after Spellbound, again follows a similar formula. This film is essentially a Freudian reimagining of the Bluebeard tale, and tells the story of Celia Barrett, who, while on a trip in Mexico, falls in love with the mysterious Mark Lamphere. The two decide to get married, but soon after Celia realizes that she doesn't really know anything about this man. And it turns out that he was actually married once before and even has a kid. And after moving into his house, she also comes to learn of Mark's strange hobby.
Now, the first room that you're about to see is the salon of the Comtesse de Bleu-Manoir. It was sealed by her husband on the morning of August 25th, 1572. I first heard of it in Paris 9 years ago. It started my collection.
Well, it must have cost considerable to copy a room like this.
It isn't a copy. These are the original rooms, down to the last detail, as much as possible.
I bet there's a love story.
Not exactly.
What happened?
Murder, my dear.
He collects reconstructions of famous murder rooms. Yeah, that's a red flag if I've ever heard one. But one of the rooms, number 7, is off limits, and Mark refuses to talk about it. So of course, Celia decides to make a copy of the key and find out what's inside, which turns out to be a replica of her own bedroom, which was also Mark's first wife's bedroom. This film also features constant references to Freud and psychoanalysis.
Did you just get here?
No, I saw you on the lawn, but as usual, you were going yuckity, yuckity, yuckity.
Oh, it's a wonderful party. I got rid of gallons of repressed poison.
Paging Mr. Freud.
Oh, darling, my subconscious is a booby trap.
He was a sordid little rat.
Who was the victim?
His mother.
That's rather rare. Murder of a mother by her son.
She's a brain psych major.
In many cases, the murder of a girlfriend or a wife has its psychological roots in an unconscious hatred for the mother.
And also presents a neurotic character who has some sort of childhood trauma to deal with. Secret Beyond the Door ends in a very similar way to Marnie, with our protagonist Celia narrowly avoiding being murdered by her husband through forcing him to confront his repressed memories, thus liberating him of his subconscious demons. In this film, the subversion is that Mark thought that the cause for his issues was his hatred for his mother, but it turned out that his sister was actually to blame all along.
You were locked in.
She locked me in. I heard her turn the key. I called her. She left for the dance. I pounded on the door until there was blood on my hands, till the nails were torn to the quick. I ran to the window and I saw her drive away with a man. I called her, and I cried. I snatched the lilacs, strangled them, crushed them, killed them. I wanted to kill her. 10, I hated her. But I knew that someday. Tonight.
Carol unlocked the door, Mark. It wasn't your mother, it was Carolyn. She told me.
In these movies, psychoanalysis becomes the catharsis of the story, a powerful narrative tool used to engineer the climax of the film. And as you can see, these writers weren't incredibly creative with how they implemented their characters' complexes into the story. In Spellbound, Marnie, and Secret Beyond the Door, the Freudian complex is rather simplistically reduced to a symbol or colour or some kind of visual encapsulation of the repressed memory. And this formula becomes somewhat tired and repetitive, especially when you watch a bunch of these films in a row. And there are a plethora of other films from this era of Hollywood that deal with similar ideas in a similar way. The Dark Mirror, for example, which features Rorschach tests and free association. There's also Whirlpool, which finds a character using hypnosis to get away with murder. The Naked Kiss, where a woman enters a relationship with a man who appears perfect on the surface, but then turns out to be a child molester. Not all of these films follow the exact same formula seen in Spellbound, Marnie, and Secret Beyond the Door. Those three films are sort of the prototypical examples of this genre, but they all speak to this new wave of Freudian obsession that was starting to take over cinema and Western culture in general. This obsession, of course, had to result in a Freud biopic, which came out in 1962, directed by John Huston. And what's most interesting to note about this film is that it seems to be taking as fact that Freud's ideas were correct, and everyone who disagrees with him and mocks his theories is presented as a fool, who we can now all retrospectively look back on the same way we would someone making fun of Galileo for saying the Earth revolves around the sun.
Thank you, Dr. Freud. I believe I reflect the sentiments of my colleagues when I assure you of our appreciation of your report. It is my personal opinion, however, that there is nothing in what we have heard that is particularly new to Viennese physicians.
I will say a few words. I beg to disagree with our esteemed chairman. But I have found in what we've been told some ideas that are new and some ideas that are true. But the ideas that are true are not new, and those that are new are not true. It is true that certain patients show nervous disorders similar to those that have been presented to us, but that is not new. None of us is unaware that violent emotions can affect the central nervous system. But why this talk of diabolic ideas and the unconscious? Are we theologians or physicians? Again, when our young colleague feels obliged to instruct and enlighten his seniors about hypnotism, he forgets in his enthusiasm that he is telling us nothing new. Unfortunately, it is not true that hypnotism is a scientific method. Personally, I consider the hypnotist and his subject a pair of sick people, of whom the more seriously sick is certainly not the one hypnotized.
And I think this reveals the underlying sentiment going around at the time that Freud's ideas are scientific fact, and we know that for sure now, or at least maybe that's what some circles were trying to push. And we see this in another John Huston film, his 1946 documentary Let There Be Light, which was intended to educate the public on PTSD and show the various treatments returning veterans were going through at the time. In all of these films, even this documentary, you really get the feeling that these filmmakers are excited to make use of this new psychological vocabulary. They take great pleasure in explaining the various conditions, like they're showing off the magic of psychoanalysis. Let There Be Light has a great scene where a soldier is put into a drug-induced hypnotic state where he confronts his negative feelings for his mother in order to overcome his condition. The doctor creates this free association style conversation in order to lead the patient to the root of his psychological issues.
That's fine. Now sit yourself over there.
I started crying. I lost control of my legs and my arms.
Was there any reason for crying spells?
I don't know, sir.
Anything happen at home to bother you?
Well, my mother's been ill.
She has been ill.
That's right.
Does that worry you a lot?
Quite a bit.
Well, now, has this got anything to do with your mother's illness? Any reason why you should have that kind of reaction?
No, sir, not that I know of. Unless my mother's illness might have brought this on. I try to hold in while it hurts, but...
I see. You've just been holding these things in.
That's right, sir. My shoes.
Right, now we'll leave the shoes on so you can walk in them. I think we're going to get you walking. Let's come over here. That's the boy. That's fine. That's good. Now you lie steady. Lie steady. That's the boy. This is all going to go away as I give you this medicine. No bother at all.
The method employed here is effective in certain types of acute cases. An intravenous injection of sodium amytal induces a state similar to hypnosis. The use of this drug serves a twofold purpose. Like hypnosis, it is a shortcut to the unconscious mind. As a surgeon probes for a bullet, the psychiatrist explores the submerged regions of the mind, attempting to locate and bring to the surface the emotional conflict which is the cause of the patient's distress. The second purpose of this drug is to remove, through suggestion, those symptoms which impede the patient's recovery.
Now tell me a little bit about what you're thinking of. The thoughts are coming to your mind now.
Nothing in particular.
Well, now let's go back. Let's go back to Friday.
Friday?
Yeah, think about that.
Friday. My mother argues with me.
Your mother argues with you?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What does she argue about?
Well, every little thing. If you sit down in a long chair or something like that. Doesn't like the stuff you get in the store.
Uh-huh.
Then she calms down.
Well, see, have you always tried to please her?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Always tried to please her.
I used to clean the house for her when I was small.
Well, now why do you think she argues like that? Because she's sick?
Well, she doesn't try to control her temper, I guess.
I see. Sit up on the side of the bed. Here you are. That's fine. All right, now stand up. Now look at that. Is that good? All right, now walk out here. Walk over to the nurse all by yourself. That's the boy. Walk over to the nurse. You're just a little woozy. That's the medicine. Now come back to me. Come back to me. Open your eyes. That's the boy. Isn't that fine? Isn't that wonderful?
Sure.
All right, now again, once more.
Unsurprisingly, at the time of its initial release, the film was somewhat controversial because of its open portrayal of the psychological trauma of war and the potentially demoralizing effect it could have on post-war recruitment. The documentary was banned, only to be released 35 years later in 1981 at the Cannes Film Festival.
Under the guidance of the psychiatrist, he is able to regard his experience in its true perspective as a thing of the past, which no longer threatens his safety. Now he can remember.
As the novelty of these Freudian concepts wears off and the theories become more commonplace in popular culture, we see different kinds of films featuring psychoanalytical ideas. These ideas aren't limited solely to melodrama and thriller. They start to spread to different genres. Woody Allen, for example, injects his comedy with a sort of Freudian dimension, his films often featuring characters in therapy or even sometimes being directly built around certain Freudian concepts, like in the 1989 anthology film New York Stories, for which Woody Allen directed the segment Oedipus Rex. This segment tells the story of Sheldon Mills' relationship with his overbearing Jewish mother, who one day, after disappearing during a live magic performance, appears as a giant head in the sky.
Sheldon, where have you been? I've been looking all over for you. I was just discussing your problem with these nice people.
Where are you?
Do I know? Look, Sheldon, I've had plenty of time to think about it. Don't get married.
Not here.
All of this is solved, however, when Sheldon starts dating a woman who's more like his mother. And there were also some even stranger approaches to Freud, as we can see in the 1976 film The 7% Solution, a Sherlock Holmes story where Watson tricks Sherlock into going to Vienna to be treated by Sigmund Freud.
Good morning, Herr Holmes, and you too, Dr. Watson. I am happy to welcome you gentlemen to my house.
You may remove that ludicrous beard, and kindly refrain from employing that ridiculous comic operetta accent. I warn you, you'd best confess or it will go hard with you, Professor Moriarty.
My name is Sigmund Freud.
So here towards the end of the 20th century, we can already perceive a sort of ironic detachment from Freud's ideas, as they have been incorporated into Western culture and are now ripe for satirization, or at least are beginning to be exploited in a less self-serious manner. But Hollywood directors weren't the only ones to take an interest in Freud's work. Many foreign filmmakers, or as we non-Americans call them, filmmakers, also tackled Freudian concepts, and generally in a more artsy, or some might say pretentious manner. One of these directors was Pier Paolo Pasolini, the guy who made this.
Mangia! 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 Mangia ancora!
But unfortunately, that's not the film we'll be discussing today. No, instead we'll be taking a look at Pasolini's Oedipus Rex, which reimagines the classic tale of Greek mythology through a Freudian lens, because of course someone had to do it at some point. But the thing is, there's nothing really Oedipal in the Freudian sense about the story of Oedipus. The myth of Oedipus is, as it's generally told, a story about the treachery of prophecies and the tricky nature of fate. So the way Pasolini chooses to add a Freudian lens to the story is by framing it with an autobiographical prelude, which takes place in a pre-war Italy, where a jealous father abandons his son in the desert, at which point the narrative switches to the ancient world of the Greek myth. There is one major modification to the story of Oedipus, though, and that comes in the confrontation with the Sphinx. And I'm not just talking about the fact that in this version, the Sphinx, a mythical creature which is wreaking havoc on an entire city, is just a dude with a mask. No, the major change is that here we don't find the Sphinx's famous enigma. Instead, as soon as Oedipus arrives before the Sphinx, he tells him, "There's an enigma in your life. What is it?" And then Oedipus just attacks him, and the Sphinx is like, "It's useless. The abyss where you're thrusting me is inside you." So Oedipus just fucking kills the guy. So instead of simply having Oedipus answer a riddle, here Pasolini seems intent on recharacterizing the mythical figure as someone driven by urges, sometimes violent ones. This Oedipus is a character in denial, a character who has this enigma, this terrifying truth within him, but does not want to confront it. So instead, he pushes it down into the abyss of his subconscious, as stated by the Sphinx. This Oedipus is also way more into having sex with his mum. I mean, they fuck a lot. The film ends with a return to contemporary Italy, where we see the Oedipus character, now blind, wandering the streets playing the recorder, then returning home to where the film began. In a 1967 interview, Pasolini explains the ending like this. The epilogue is what Freud calls the sublimation. Once Oedipus has blinded himself, he re-enters society by sublimating all his faults. One of the forms of sublimation is poetry. He plays the pipe, which means metaphorically he is a poet. First he plays for the bourgeoisie, and he plays the old Japanese music connected with the oracle, ancestral, private, confessional music, music that could be defined in one word as decadent. This is a kind of evocation of the primitive, of his origins. Then, disgusted by the bourgeoisie, he goes off and plays his pipe to the workers. And there he plays a tune which was one of the songs of the resistance. It was a Russian folk tune which some Italian soldiers learnt in Russia and was sung during the resistance as a revolutionary song. So in this sequence, we see the Oedipus character engaging in an act of sublimation, which is to say, in Freudian terms, that he transforms his libido into socially and culturally useful activities and achievements, in this case, art. The artist transmutes their sexual energy into creative energy. Another European director who tackled psychoanalytical ideas was the Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman, and while many of his films such as Cries and Whispers, Autumn Sonata, Hour of the Wolf, or Persona could be read as Freudian as they deal with psychosexual urges and a variety of twisted parent-child relationships, perhaps the Bergman film which is most explicitly Freudian in its subject matter and construction is Face to Face from 1976. Face to Face tells the story of Dr. Jenny Isaacson, played by Liv Ullmann, a psychiatrist working a temporary job at a mental hospital while her husband and daughter are away in America. She's been staying with her grandparents in her childhood bedroom where she lived after her parents died, and this is where a bunch of weird shit starts happening. She keeps having visions of a one-eyed old lady. And she almost gets raped by two men. And then later tells her new friend Thomas that she actually wishes she was raped. Where the story really starts to get Freudian is when Jenny downs a handful of sleeping pills and we subsequently enter her dreamscape. An interesting thing to note here is that the structure of this story isn't so dissimilar to that of the string of Freudian Hollywood films we discussed, albeit with a more artsy packaging. It's the story of a character who is suffering from some kind of deep-seated psychological ailment, who enters into a relationship, digs deep within her psyche, and comes to some kind of realization about her emotional issues with the help of the partner. Of course, in this film, the psychological issue on display, the relationship that's developed, and the resolution to the story aren't as straightforward and clear-cut as they were in those other movies, but the basic formula is very similar. And both Hollywood's and the foreign filmmakers' interpretations of Freud's ideas would then go on to influence modern directors such as Darren Aronofsky, as we can see in his film Black Swan, where the character of Nina's self-destructive drive for perfection is inextricably linked to her relationship with her mother, who also used to be a dancer but was never able to reach the heights that she now wishes for Nina. This conflicted relationship with the mother pervades modern fiction, probably because it's such an interesting dynamic to portray on screen. One of my favourite portrayals of a completely fucked mother-child relationship, which features a character named Erica, whose psychology I'm not really sure I have time to fully analyze. Needless to say that her issues are certainly related to her relationship with her domineering mother.
Tu pourrais ouvrir un hôtel de passe. Ce que pensent les voisins, tu t'en fous. De toute façon, c'est toujours pareil, tu n'en fais qu'à ta tête.
Ma chérie, je t'aime. Mais arrête, mais t'es complètement débile, enfin. Mais qu'est-ce que tu... Allez, arrête. Mais arrête tes cochonneries, enfin, t'as complètement perdu la tête. Ferme-la, je t'aime. Moi aussi, je t'aime. Moi aussi, je t'aime. Mais arrête, j'en supplie.
But sometimes this relationship doesn't even have to be explicitly depicted on screen. You can build the thematic through-line of a movie on the lasting presence of a mother, as we see in Paul Thomas Anderson's Phantom Thread.
Are you here? Are you always here? I miss you. I think about you all the time.
And of course, Freudian ideas made their way to television as well.
Oh, Jesus Christ, will you make up your fucking sick mind? First it's my mother, now I want to fuck my sister?
It's normal.
And The Sopranos is perhaps the best example of where Freud's ideas are at in culture at this specific point.
Obviously, we finally touched on something here. What you witnessed that day, where the meat came from, and your mother's great pleasure in it?
Was the only time you could count on her being in a good mood. Probably the only time the old man got laid. Pretty sick, huh? Getting turned on by free cold cuts.
Do you think that your mother questioned why the meat was free? The meat that was going into her children's mouths?
I don't know. I don't want to know. I don't even want to fucking think about any of this shit.
I'm sure it was too much for you then, too. That's why you short-circuited. Puberty. Witnessing not only your mother and father's sexuality, but also the violence and blood so closely connected to the food you were about to eat. And also the thought that someday you might be called upon to bring home the bacon. Like your father.
All this from a slice of gabagool.
Tony's frustration with his therapy sessions and the constant barrage of psychoanalytical interpretations Dr. Melfi constructs for his behavior is perhaps indicative of a certain distancing from these theories, an acknowledgement that, at the end of the day, maybe this is all just bullshit, and worse than that, maybe it's not even helpful bullshit.
Kinda like Proust's Madeleines.
What?
Marcel Proust wrote a 7-volume classic, Remembrance of Things Past. He took a bite of a Madeleine. It's a kind of a tea cookie he used to have when he was a child. And that one bite unleashed a tide of memories of his childhood and ultimately of his entire life.
This sounds very gay.
But this isn't just the story of Freud's ideas specifically. This entire history is the story of psychoanalysis in general, and society's developing relationship with the human psyche and the acknowledgement of its importance. I think this period in Hollywood's history is indicative of a culture coming to accept a relatively new and somewhat scary way of looking at the world and ourselves. What Freud's ideas introduced to Western society were insightful, yet dangerous in many ways, opening up an entire new dimension to explore. It's not surprising then that this new unexplored territory would fan the flames of many of Hollywood's greatest directors' creativity, giving them a whole new world to explore, new thematic territory and new possibilities for narrative structure, focusing on fighting inner demons rather than outside forces. Freud's ideas were popular with artists for the same reasons they gained popularity with the masses. These concepts appeal to us. They're easily understood and, well, easily marketable. Most of Freud's technical terms sound like ordinary figures of speech. Concepts like defense mechanism and repressed guilt are practically designed for armchair psychologists. They're catchy. For the artist, the rising popularity of psychoanalysis introduced an entirely new world of storytelling to be explored, and not just that, but a dimension that was both complex enough to appeal to academics and more artistically minded people, and accessible enough to a wider audience because of the common sense quality of most of these concepts. It's impossible to overstate the impact that Freud and the rest of the psychoanalytical school of psychology had on Western culture and society as a whole, not just in art, but in business and academia. And I think that oftentimes there's no better way to track the public's relationship with an idea than to look at how it's represented in the media we consume. And I think Freud's ideas are a perfect demonstration of this.
I started my professional activity as a neurologist, trying to bring relief to my neurotic patients. And by my own efforts, I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious in psychic life, the role of instinctual urges, and so on. Out of these findings grew a new science, psychoanalysis. People did not believe in my facts and thought my theories unsavory. My name? Sigmund Freud. Is all right now?